Hello, and welcome back to this episode of the Marginal Babble podcast. In today's episode, I sit down to talk with Professor John Duca to discuss his research pertaining to house pricing cycles that he conducted alongside Anthony Murphy and John Muehlbauer. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and without further ado, let's get into the episode. Enjoy. What does drive housing price cycles?
Typically, lower mortgage rates or the easing of housing credit standards pushes up demand relative to supply and hence prices. And then this in turn is amplified by increased house price appreciation that makes housing more attractive. And then more attractive investment that further pushes up housing demand and prices. And eventually, as we climb that hill, house prices get so high that housing demand dries up, maybe mortgage interest rates reverse and rise, or maybe lenders need to tighten overly eased mortgage credit standards as mortgage loans become delinquent. And then we go in reverse. House price appreciation slows, that makes housing a less attractive investment, and that amplifies the downturn. So we're very prone to these boom and bust cycles in house prices.
Sure. And are those cycles perpetuated or to some degree caused by government action and government regulation, whether that be in regards to, decreasing interest rates? I mean, I remember having a conversation with David Miles on one of my previous episodes, and then where he basically laid out, the big cause of, at least in the UK, for house price increases over the past 20, 30 years was, not migration or house building like some of these other factors that people will say, but was in fact to do with just having incredibly low interest rates. And as interest rates slow into the future, or sort of go up into go higher, or at least as compared to where they were, potentially you're going to see less out of this housing growth. So does government policy almost perpetuate some of these cycles more than they would naturally?
It can. So for example, in the early 2000s, as Governor Miles mentioned, very low interest rates in response to fighting the COVID recession. And in some cases, easier credit standards kicked off a surge in house prices that later busted. And during the recovery from the COVID recession, we saw a house price boom that was kicked off by low interest rates and also a rise in the demand for working at home or second homes outside of city centers. And sometimes you can get these other special factors. And I think in defense of central banks, we were in a dire situation with the COVID recession. No one knew how well the vaccines would work. The vaccines worked. We all came out of our foxholes and people rushed to buy. So you have to be careful about having an interest rate cycle that swings too much. But at the same time, if you have more, we could talk more about some of the things you can do later on, perhaps. But if you have more responsive increases in house price and housing supply as prices rise, that can temper some of this boom and not be so bad. So government policy certainly is part of this, but part of it is also that people tend to extrapolate the past into the future. And one of the reasons in housing markets is there are big costs of buying and selling. It takes a long time to buy a house and make that decision. And so there are a lot of momentum effects, and you have to be very much aware of that.
Sure. Ultimately, it's quite a liquid asset when you compare it to, buying gold or, even stock prices in the modern day, where you can just go onto an app and purchase it for, very, 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 very quickly.
Exactly.
And to your point, in regards to some of those costs associated with it, where in the UK it would be stamp duty and all this kind of stuff, there are associated costs on it, which means you would probably want to hold it for a longer period of time, right? And so that sort of accentuates some of these pretty momentum effects, I would imagine. Your paper goes into this in regard to sort of looking at these cycles. Are you able to just outline for me what the objectives of this research was and what you were trying to achieve for the research?
Well, first, we wanted to provide a consistent framework to understand house price cycles across countries. There are big cross-country differences in interest rates, credit standards, and differing extents to which housing supply can expand and help contain upward pressure on house prices. We wanted to account for such differences and explain why some countries have greater house price booms and busts than others. The second goal was to review the literature within that framework to help housing economists and policymakers make sense of the research that's been done, but also of the future research that is needed.
Okay. And through the work that you were doing, do you have any insight into the results of the research and what were you able to conclude from the findings that you had?
Well, I would say that big swings in interest rate cycles can kick off house price booms and busts, but also ill-advised mortgage regulations. Some countries allowed lenders, they relaxed regulation under Basel II, which was a framework that gave banks a lot more leeway, and that set off a non-sustainable easing of mortgage credit standards. People who were too risky to get mortgages couldn't handle them, and that can feed into the cycles. But also, housing supply matters a lot. And here we've seen a decline in the old days in the US. If house prices rose, home builders would build more houses, and that would temper the rise in house prices, and that would help keep the cycle muted. What's happened since then is zoning restrictions have become tighter, and we didn't build enough transportation. And so in the old days, if close-in neighborhoods near the city centers got too expensive, people were able to move further out. Builders could build on that land, and but people could live in an area where they could still commute in. We haven't, our transportation infrastructure just hasn't kept up in many cases. And so transportation becomes a housing issue. I mean, there's lots of land in many countries, but the reality for people on the ground is, can I live in a place where I can also work?
Yeah.
We're close enough to it. And so, after World War II in the US, we not only had new mortgage programs, but we had tremendous increases in transportation that allowed the development of suburbs, for example. And that took a lot of pressure off house prices. I hope I didn't go into a lot.
No, certainly. And I think it's interesting when you talk about infrastructure and the ability to have better technology in many ways in order to build out further from these centers where a lot of the jobs and economic activity is occurring, which sort of ease pressure on certain house prices to some degree. I think, you mentioned it a little bit already, but particularly what I was anticipating, particularly sort of post-COVID world in which a lot of people are working from home more, was potentially an alleviating of house prices within urban centers. Because people will be able to sort of work from home 2 days a week, 3 days, whatever it is. And that would allow people to sort of commute further out. And just honestly, just in the increase in technology would allow people to conduct certain jobs from home a lot more. The increases in even technology, like the stuff that we're using now allows us to record remotely, but also increases in general technology for businesses as well. And certainly I've seen like an adoption, even the companies I've been a part of the adoption of that technology. What's kind of surprised me is that there hasn't necessarily been the demand shift, at least that I would maybe have anticipated from people moving out into these rural sort of further out areas. And I think maybe it's just a representation of ultimately, if a lot of the growth and the activity and the jobs are still located in these sort of urban centers, it's still going to have a sort of a large impact on the house prices, generally more speaking, and ultimately people do actually want to be around people and amenities. You could go out very far and build a house in the middle of nowhere and it's still possible to work from home potentially. But ultimately, if there aren't the people, the amenities and all these things that you want to be around, then obviously it's just simply not going to be worth as much as something that's located nearer to a big urban area. And so is there any sort of other insight that you can perhaps grant in regards to this in terms of the relationship of infrastructure building and the relationship to the house pricing cycles and this kind of stuff?
Well, I think the work from home aspect certainly has bolstered U.S. house prices. That's some of the findings that Anthony Murphy and John Muehlbauer and I have in some
Hmm.
work that we have underway. But we've also seen the so-called donut effect. And
Hmm.
so people have kept some of their urban center or near urban center houses or apartments, but have also moved further out. So we're seeing a lot more people with two homes. And in those rural areas, we are seeing increases in house prices without the increase in housing supply to
Hmm.
alleviate it. And so rather, to some extent, it helps reduce average house costs for those who have one home, but it's putting upward pressure in some of these outlying areas. The other thing I would say is the hybrid model seems to be the one that many works for many professionals. And you're absolutely right. You need time at the office to work with each other, uh, much communication and much work together is nonverbal. And we pick up those cues, and it's hard to pick it up. I mean, as best we try as best we can here.
Sure, certainly.
Um, but what I have done, what one of my students and I found was that this this effect of working in the outskirts is it's very critical to public transport, so that you can go in, 1 or 2 or 3 days a week if need be, and you have to have good internet service.
Hmm.
And, in much of the United States, we don't have good internet service, and that's a big issue.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because particularly with like working from home as well, if you are going to move to that kind of model, that would imply that you're going to spend more time in your domicile, your residence, and that would, potentially also mean that you probably need more space for office areas and home operating activities. In addition to the things that you just mentioned, perhaps you could, if you're an avid reader or something, don't watch much TV or stream or whatever, you can maybe have a house that doesn't necessarily have the internet connection that was potentially other people would require. But suddenly with this move to working from home, you might actually require like a really strong fiber connection. And all these things come with associated costs, whether it's the increased space for working from home or the increased fiber connection, right? And certain amenities around the local area, potentially even for like roads and office spaces as more people move out. And so maybe that's also a contributing factor to why um, houses in these more rural locations, or at least maybe not too rural, but more further out locations, are being bolstered by some of these effects.
Very much so, and I think we need to public policy needs to address that. My wife's hometown is on the far outskirts of the greater New York area, and it's just amazing how many people have moved there. And we see digital nomads. We see people who may come out for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and then they move. Then they go back to their closer in locations, and the schools are feeling a little bit more enrollment and the like. So there certainly is this adjustment. But over the long run, we may see some relocations of both firms and workers to further out areas, and that could help alleviate the cost, provided that we allow for housing supply to increase in these areas.
Sure. And how do the effects that we've just mentioned, in along with the house pricing cycles as well, how does this affect the rental market in particular? Is it nuanced in its effects on actual compared to the house pricing market? But how does it affect rental markets in particular, particularly as we move into an environment where house price inflation is in comparison to wages growth in the UK, US, and a lot of Western countries is getting higher and higher and higher. If you go back 30 years or so, the average wage in a lot of these countries compared to the average house price was maybe 4 times the average annual wage. And now in a lot of the countries, we're getting towards 8 to 10% in a lot of areas, which would indicate to me that we're probably moving into an environment where a lot more people have to be renters. I'm going to spend more long time renting. So is there a nuanced difference in between the market for buying houses and then the rental market itself?
Well, I think that one of the key things to understand about housing, single family homes, for example, is they're a combination of land and structure.
Yeah.
And multifamily housing is much more efficient in terms of the use of land.
Yeah.
And so when you see interest rates go lower and stimulate housing demand, or maybe higher incomes, for example, in Ireland and Spain during their boom years, what you see is you see this upward pressure on land costs. and has a disproportionate effect on the cost of single-family homes versus multifamily homes. And so we are seeing in the U.S., for example, more multifamily relative to what we would see in the past. Now, that is, so there we have to think about, well, maybe we should think about policies that make it easier for people to maybe buy a multifamily unit rather than rent. And then also the other subtlety is that multifamily units are more amenable to being rented out than single family detached homes, where you have to maintain the property and all that. And so you'll see in housing busts in Dallas, somebody built some beautiful condos right near downtown Dallas. We had the housing bust. They went from being for sale to being for rent. And then later on, they converted back to condos. And so you'll see this subtlety there. Inequality has been linked to housing in the U.S., for example. It's one of the big elements. And if you do things to expand home ownership, you can help reduce inequality.
Sure. And you spoke about some of these sort of house buying schemes for sort of individuals on the lower end of the spectrum there, in terms of wealth, in terms of getting onto the housing market. Some of those schemes that have been tried in the UK, things like Help to Buy, and that help, if you're a first-time buyer, the government kind of provides assistance on sort of get it in terms of the deposit and whatnot. I think some of the criticisms of those schemes that I've seen is that ultimately what this does is it still inflates pricing, because ultimately people buy housing in a very particular way that they just don't simply do with other goods. Quite typically, people will look at what amount they've got in the bank for a deposit. They will check what they can borrow, the maximum is that they can borrow depending on their salary. They add those two figures together and they buy a property at that value, maybe even a little bit more in some instances. Now, you just simply don't do that with other goods. If everyone was doing that with cars or whatever it is, we'd all be driving around in Mercedes Benzes. But now there's obviously some nuance to that in regard to the fact that the expectation is that house prices are predicted to go up, and so ultimately it's not really a consumption good. It is an investment asset as well. But with that being said, the argument would then be, if you're just making it more readily available to people to buy and get onto the ladder, you're essentially just increasing the prices for those individuals that are trying to get onto the ladder. And ultimately, the only people that necessarily benefit are the construction companies, who essentially just get to, sell the house or the properties for a higher amount.
If they're able to even build a house. I think the existing homeowners also benefit by that. There's an unintended consequence. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. Two of my old co-authors, Stuart Gabriel and Stuart Rosenthal, pointed out many years ago, in the early 2000s, are these policies counterproductive or not very productive insofar as all we're doing is pushing up demand relative to inelastic supply? Perhaps in the days when housing construction could actually be stimulated by an increase in housing demand and prices, that could work. But I think that's, we really do need to address the supply side.
Certainly.
We can still provide some help for first-time buyers, but without the supply, we're not really doing enough to solve the underlying problem.
Certainly. And on the supply side, and you can probably enlighten me to more of the policies and the effects there are in the States, but in the UK, we're in a bit of a weird situation at the moment in regards to house building. In regards to it, it's very hard to build houses, and the government keeps setting targets of 300,000 or whatever it is, and just can't seem to meet them. And a lot of people say that, well, it's regulation. We need to deregulate. Make it easier for construction companies to come in and build them. If they make profit, they'll be more willing to build, and they can make more profit. We'll have more housing supply. However, we also have incidences in the UK as well where we actually, if anything, need more regulation. We've had incidences on instances like Grenfell, and other sort of high-rise blocks where they used non-flame retardant cladding on the outside, and essentially meant that, the buildings go up in flames and unfortunately killed like a lot of people. And that meant that a lot of these buildings, actually, people got stuck in a scenario where actually they were stuck with these massive lump sum costs for changing cladding on the outside of their homes that they simply couldn't afford, and they couldn't go after the construction companies because they'd already gone bust. And the additional cost in some instances to do this was thousands of pounds. It wasn't even necessarily that high. And you've also got instances like with constructions of schools. There's been sort of instances of construction companies using aerated concrete, which has eventually led to certain falling down, which is incredibly worrying when you consider, in particular, that there's children that are operating in these environments. So on the one hand, we need to deregulate because we need to provide more efficiency and make it easier for construction companies to be able to solve that supply problem. But on the other hand, it feels almost that we need to do more regulation and do more work to control the construction companies and their ability to make quality housing. And I sometimes wonder, like, how actually you marry those two problems and how you can effectively address both of them in a way that is actually satisfactory and will actually sort of solve the problem.
Well, I think, it's a question of having better regulation, of course. And once again, if we think about land and structures, we can start to sort this out. I think one of the biggest problems is that there are too many zoning restrictions in general. What that does is it reduces the supply of buildable lots. And in some cases, that zoning stuff could be even allowing multifamily construction. Maybe we should consider having more multifamily construction along public transit corridors, for example, so that we can deal with the green issues of the environment, but also allow for shared green space. That will lower land costs. Or in the UK, for example, reconsider how property is taxed, which currently favors big estates and locks up a lot of land. My co-author John Duca has written on that. I think that's it. So there's the aspect of regulating land. I'm not saying let's build houses on environmentally sensitive, places. In terms of the structures, there you can still have a good building code, right? You can still require things to be built with, using proper cement, proper rebar to support concrete structures or non-flammable stuff. One of the key areas with, dealing with construction is many places, and I don't know enough about the UK to talk about the UK, but in the United States, a lot of places, it makes it virtually impossible for builders to prefabricate sections of a house in a climate-controlled factory and then take those things and assemble a house on site. And what they found is you can bring down the cost of building a structure quite a bit if you have the workers work in a climate-controlled environment. They don't have to worry about rain stopping a project. It's much safer for them. They don't have to worry about heat stroke in the middle of the summer or freezing to death in the winter. It sounds trivial, but it can actually, involve a lot of savings.
No, certainly. I work for a company that does a lot of construction projects, and I know firsthand the delays, costs certainly come from weather conditions, ground being too hard, there being too much water, all these kind of things. These are
delays. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, and so the regulation, and by the way, it's much easier for a home inspector to come into a factory and to make sure that things are being built. Whereas if they have to go to all these different sites, that makes it much more expensive, slows the process down. With zoning, by the way, we can also speed up the permitting process. But that means that communities have to work through where do we want to do? Where are we going to allow building? Let's be a little more proactive that way. But one of the keys, and you touched on this, Max, which is we lost a lot of construction companies during the great housing busts. And so there's very little competition. And part of the reason there's little competition is, well, there's not much potential to build houses. So if we allow for more building in areas. Uh, we can do that sensibly. We'll get more construction funds form. But there are other bottlenecks, right? We have land as a bottleneck. We have land and zoning as a bottleneck, right? But we also have, in addition to not allowing prefab construction or modular construction, we have problem of shortages of trained construction workers, electricians, plumbers. And, many of the vocational training programs that we had after World War II are gone. And here we can provide more vocational training of such workers. And that's key to preventing the labor shortage from becoming a bottleneck. And it's an issue in the US. And by the way, these jobs are the kind of jobs that are less likely to be replaced or threatened by AI.
Exactly what I was just thinking. Particularly, generally speaking, across Western countries and in the UK as well, a lot of research has sort of been coming out now and sort of data in regards to overeducation or underemployment. This idea that there's an increasing amount of people that are overqualified for the jobs that they are taking. And this is increasing because more and more people are going to university usually and then ending up in jobs that didn't necessarily require them to do a university degree. This has a multitude of impacts, not least because university education is expensive for a variety of reasons. One, in terms of just the nominal cost of it and the provision to be able to provide it, but also your time. It's a very time-intensive process, 3 to 4 years in many instances to get those degrees and qualifications. Time that you could have maybe been working, paying taxes and all this kind of stuff for the general economy. And it's just very interesting. And then also just in regards to the affordability of housing, if people are paying down student loan debts and stuff, it's going to make them much harder for them to get on the property ladder. And I think there's been a lot of discussion in regards to, this is maybe a little bit different in the States, but in the UK, the university tuition is subsidized. So tuition is like $9,000 a year pretty much for any university you go to. Obviously, if you're coming from externally, you pay the full private tuition value, but for the UK citizens, it's subsidized. And ultimately, the question is rising in an environment where we are constantly having more and more constrictions on what we can spend money on with aging demographics, a higher welfare bill, and slowing growth. Is subsidizing tertiary education, university education, when we've already potentially oversupplied in it? Is that something that we should maybe be doing? And perhaps instead, the opportunity cost might be taking some of that subsidization cost and maybe putting it into some of those qualifications and training programs and apprenticeships for the things that you just mentioned. That, to your other point, are probably also more likely to not be disrupted by AI that's coming in. A lot of the degree educated jobs, or at least all the lower level ones, the entry positions, are kind of being mopped up a lot a bit because ultimately they can be automated away in many instances. And on the other hand, it is very difficult to automate away someone coming as a plumber coming around to sort of plumb in your house.
I know lots of people in the construction trades who are not college educated, but they're brilliant. They know how to solve problems. They know how to get things done. They have a situational awareness, which is wonderful. We want to raise the skill level of our people. And that can take a lot of different forms. And providing some more choice, particularly in the skilled trades, I think could really make a huge difference. And one of the things that they've done in Cleveland, for example, was the mayor and many leaders in the real estate industry have done things like, let's promote the building of a modular construction plants. It's much, work in construction is tough. I've done that. I did that as a second job in my college summers. My dad built houses at one point in his life. My grandfather was in construction. It's not easy to do it, but if it's climate controlled, it makes a big difference. And if we provide the training, because companies are always worried about people jumping from one company to another, that's why you have to provide some training. I think we can make a huge difference. And in Cleveland, we're really starting to see the housing stock getting rebuilt. And if you're concerned about green issues, I would say We have a river called the Cuyahoga River. It used to be so polluted it would catch fire. In fact, it caught fire so many times that it it caused a turning point in American environmental policy that we created the EP, the Environmental Protection Agency.
Oh,
But
right.
we've
Okay.
taken a stretch of the Cuyahoga River. It's called Irishtown Bend, and this was a brown site. This was, just some dilapidated buildings and God knows what. And all of a sudden, but by focusing on the zoning, by working with the builders and one of the big mortgage companies in town was very key. They've taken this brownfield and they provided great housing. People love living along it. So there are a lot of cities that need to be renamed. We've got
Yeah.
we've got the road network, we've got the electricity, we've got the sewage systems. It's not that, if we can remake them, it's a lot cheaper than, let's say, building new towns, in the middle of nowhere where you have to build all that transportation infrastructure. So,
Yeah.
I mean, these are things we can do. And I think, but one of the things I'd have to say with housing supply is you have to take a comprehensive approach. It involves the land, but you don't deal with the problems of putting up structures. You'll have the land that's zoned, but the structures won't go up. We have to look at the whole thing together. Because housing in many respects is where people's jobs, land, building, all that comes together. And it's very complicated. It's not something, Rome wasn't built in a day. Most of our cities weren't built in a day. But if we want to fix things up, I think we really need a comprehensive. Sorry if I went too long.
No, it's great. I'm very interested in this kind of modular house design sort of information and new approach. It's probably something I just need to educate myself on and do a little bit more research on. I think the things that come to mind, I mean, certainly in terms of productivity, that's in terms of what you mentioned, being able to create these things in a climate controlled environment is going to increase productivity, not just from efficiency, from people being able to be transported around, but also, to your point, not having weather conditions that are sort of interrupting workflows and also causing damages, right? That's another thing, to materials and whatnot. I guess my wonder would be is how do with these modular designs, how effectively are essentially being transported from one location to another, and then once they're being set up on sites, essentially. And maybe this is like maybe a very obvious question that maybe I'm just sort of missing. But particularly in the UK, a lot of our roads and our networks are quite small, particularly in comparison to some of the stuff that you see in the States, right? And so in my mind, I'm imagining the ability to transport these from climate-controlled environments to certain places where they need to be would actually be quite a strong logistical challenge in many ways, particularly when you consider a lot of the building standards in the UK use that housing tends to use a lot more brick than I think a lot of the stuff in the States, probably to do with the climate and and all that sort of other stuff as well. And so I'm interested to understand a little bit more about how they're able to operate and whether there would probably be some nuances in between where you would be able to apply some of this modular design and where you maybe wouldn't be able to use some of this modular design.
Well, think about it like this, right? If you're building on site, you still have to transport the lumber, you still have to transport the bricks and all this other stuff. And you have different companies transporting different things, and you have all these different trips. Whereas if you have a central location, it makes it a little easier. And in many cases, the modular designs are done by rooms, or maybe two or three rooms. Now, that may be hard in some parts of where you have narrow roads and the like. But I would also emphasize the narrow roads make it difficult to do stick built as well. And I think that we have to keep that in mind. We're looking, I've heard estimates of 15, 20% savings on the cost of the structure. That doesn't include the land. And I've experienced that firsthand. I thought about building a house in a rural area, and doing modular would cut the structure part of the costs by about 15 to 20%. It's a huge amount of savings. And yes, they have to do certain things on site. They have to put foundation and all that. No doubt about that. Brick is an issue if you want to use brick. But then again, do we necessarily have to have brick homes? That's another issue of zone. There are more weather resistant materials now to build houses with, for example. And I think that they should be considered. By the way, brick takes quite a bit of energy to set the
Transport.
bricks. Yeah, and to
and all that
transport
kind
as
of
well, right? And then, it's not necessarily the best insulator. In parts of the country, in the U.S., for example, in the Southwest, it's very dry and very hot, and their wood will not last much. And so, in many places, I lived much of the year in Texas, where 3/4 of a house has to be masonry or brick, but there's good reason for it. Wood just simply dry up, the paint would peel off, and it's much different than a more, temperate climate. But we have to ask ourselves, why do we have these regulations? Do they still serve a purpose? Maybe they do, in which case we should keep them, but in cases where they don't, maybe we should reconsider.
Yeah. Some localized relaxing of legislation where appropriate, I think, is probably what we're getting at here. Obviously we're not potentially suggesting that you are in the middle of a sandy desert, you build out of wood and the house is gone after a couple of weeks or anything like that. But trying to relax regulation, I guess making it more localized maybe. I mean, this is something that people have obviously had some discourse around in regard to just trying to localize a lot of this legislation a lot more, giving local councils or local states or local districts the ability to come up with their own rules and giving them more flexibility on this. And perhaps this is something in an area where something like that might be a lot more appropriate because the geographies will likely be a lot more similar within, the districts or councils or however you'd like to sort of piece it out. A lot of public discourse has been given to, at least in sort of recent stuff that I've seen over the last sort of several months in regards to reducing the interest rate. Or the base rate of the Bank of England and stuff. I mean, I've seen a lot of stuff in the States about it, but also here in the UK of trying to get base rates back down to kind of like levels that they were a couple of years ago. I'm curious to know what your opinion is on this in terms of how you think it would affect house price inflation and the general housing market within the US and maybe some other regions. Because I'm very apprehensive about it. I don't necessarily think lower interest rates are actually necessarily a good thing. I think it's almost kind of a crux that you can almost kind of get hooked on very, very easily and people can get very accustomed to. And that actually wouldn't necessarily do people and could actually lead to a lot of house price inflation or bubbling where maybe it shouldn't necessarily be. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I share many of your concerns. And I think the key here is in the short run, it sounds like, lower interest rates, then your mortgage costs come down. But if it pushes up the house price, then your mortgage costs go up. Your mortgage payments go up because you're borrowing more. And it can be counterproductive. And I think there, once again, we have to deal with the supply side. If we have more ability to increase the supply of housing, then lowering interest rates a little bit could spur more housing demand and more building. So we have to think about things a little more comprehensively, Peter.
Sure. Because that's the other side of it as well, right? The lower interest rates might make loaning for projects and things like that might actually spur on some building in some regard. So you've almost got to kind of balance these things, I think. I think it's just kind of a nuanced conversation. I think it's a lot of the discourse I've seen around it is, because the other side of this as well, interest rates over the last 20 or so years, I would say are not very representative over the history of what these kind of interest rates have been. They were exceptionally low, getting down towards, sort of 1% or something in particular regions. My parents, not too long ago, were coming off of an interest rate of 2%, which almost seems ridiculous when you look at, the general history, where interest rates were even maybe at sort of 15%, going back sort of in the 80s, right, or something like that. And that obviously has an implication on house prices as well. I think that's the thing. I think ultimately, I mean, base rates and stuff are sort of hovering around sort of 4 or 5% at the moment, which is still quite actually historically low in comparison. And so I'm just, it's quite a nuanced conversation whether we should just obviously be targeting those things. I think it needs quite due care and consideration to how so we look at those things. In regards to house price and inflation more generally, is it something that you believe that government should be trying to regulate, or is it really just in regards to deregulation that's going to allow a lot of these things to happen, or is it regulation in some regards and deregulation in others?
Well, I think, the appeal of things like price controls is that they can quickly slow rent growth or house price growth in the short run. But the big problem is they deter new building, and they're very counterproductive in the long run. Very counterproductive. So I think we do need to reform regulation. Well, I don't like the term deregulate. I think it can open up a Pandora's box of ill-conceived steps to not regulate certain things that should be regulated.
Right.
And so I think we have to just zero in on the impediments to housing supply. And by the way, with the local areas, one of the big concerns that local areas have about more development is, can the roads handle it, or can the public transport handle it?
Yep.
And that's why we need to bring, transportation has to become part of the conversation. Many years ago, Richard Green and Steve Malpezzi and some others found a very strong connection between transportation infrastructure and lower house prices across metropolitan areas. And once again, it's a way of alleviating this stuff. I lived in Dallas full-time for nearly 25 years, and I still live there part-time another 8 years. But one of the things about the development in Dallas was, in the old days, they would build the roads, build the reservoirs, because water's a big issue, ahead of the development. And what that enabled Dallas to do is grow very rapidly. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is about 6.5 million people, maybe 7. But in the old days, we would build the infrastructure first, so the transportation would be there. The water would be there. We don't do that as much now. And so now even Dallas is facing problems of commuting times and upward pressures on house prices. There's a great paper, by the way, by Joe Jorko and Ed Glazer that came out in the Brookings Papers in Economic Activity this spring. And what they showed was, even in the Sunbelt cities in the U.S., which grew rapidly, what's happening now is it's becoming harder to build. And I think part of what we've seen living in Dallas for 30-some odd years is that it's a lot harder to commute now. It's harder to get around. And so transportation is part of it. We had a big housing building boom in the United States after World War II. Having the roads, having the rail enabled us, or building that enabled us to spread people out. We doubled our home ownership rate. We had great growth. We had less inequality. And it was very successful. But I think we have forgotten that transportation and housing are very intertwined. So if you want a local area to say, yes, we'll allow more multifamily, well, hey, maybe we have to build a light rail, or maybe we have to expand maybe the commuter rail service, or maybe the local buses, for example.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're going to say no, and you can't blame people for saying, hey, I don't want a lot of traffic.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. It's almost like a build it and they will come attitude almost. So if you build the infrastructure in place, it's going to put more incentives in place for housing to be built in those areas. Better connection, fiber, roads, GP
Exactly.
locations, reservoirs, big thing at the moment, actually, across the sort of Western countries as well at the moment.
Right.
It's really funny. I think it's almost like a very balanced approach, and it's actually quite nuanced. Because the other side of this is as well, and I think this is it links to something you just said in regards to, commuting times getting longer and sort of more sort of incumbent on a lot of people, is that I don't necessarily think it's just about building more roads or building more of these things. I think it's about building it in a smart way that allows for better facilitation. Because the age-old problem is okay, there's incredible traffic on this particular motorway going into Dallas or wherever. It's a 4-lane highway. I know, we'll make it an 8-lane highway, and traffic is alleviated for 6 months, and then suddenly it's right back up to where it was because people have accommodated, and actually now people are just having to move further and further and further and further and further out, and then over the aggregate, the situation is almost that it's not only the same, but it's actually worse because you're having to commute further distances and all this kind of stuff. And so your point about infrastructure is completely right. I think that the one thing that I would say is that it can't just be more, and it has to be well thought through, and it has to be a comprehensive system of infrastructure that allows these things to occur as well. It's not just roads, it's reservoirs, it's facilities to be able to do those things. It's businesses, office spaces, it's connections between office spaces as well, because so that businesses can interact and do certain businesses. It's internet connection. And it has to be done in a way that's not just allowing sort of general urban sprawl. I mean,
I can't agree more. I think, for example, if you want to have light rail or expand rail service, you have to have enough density. If you build the rail service, but you don't allow the density, then it becomes a burden on the public sector.
Yeah.
With that.
And it's an interesting one, because the examples that you mentioned there, places like Dallas and these other sort of places in America, are very different to places like New York and particularly like London and in the UK, in where these are cities that are almost, they've kind of got almost, or at least had, infinite land to expand into because of the way that sort of they're built and designed out. And so you could just build out sort of certain things and just build out and build out and build out and slowly over time, right? I think in the UK, I mean, that's generally known as urban sprawl. If you look at places like Tokyo is now sort of like sprawled out into this sort of mega city that, takes up a large proportion of the area. But in London, for example, they've tried to combat that by essentially creating another green belt around London, and so that you aren't able to sort of build out indefinitely and sort of try and contain the urban sprawl. And the idea is to try and contain some of the sort of the nature and all this kind of stuff. But that also creates housing pressures as well. If you create an isolated ring around where you're allowed to build, and suddenly, people aren't allowed to sort of move out, that is going to create pressures on housing. I guess the counter to that be, one, you're sort of preserving green spaces and allowing for those things. And you are also then at that point encouraging more people to build up as opposed to towards out. Because ultimately, to what we just mentioned a second ago, is you can build out roads that go further out, more houses that go out, but ultimately, if then people just move in, and then people still have to commute all the way in,
right,
it's still a problem. And so London doesn't necessarily, it's not a perfect solution, and it's definitely not, and it certainly has a lot of drawbacks that we can obviously get into and we have mentioned. But at least it almost tries to contain what it is, and then sort of encourages more brownfield site building potentially, and building sort of more upwards, as opposed to sort of incorporating more land and stuff. And then hopefully, places like Cambridge and Oxford are relatively nearby don't just get sucked in to like the London orbit, and it can almost become tech centres in their own right. And then, people don't have to sort of, travel on 3-hour train journeys or 3-hour sort of a car ride just to get into work every day.
To make that feasible, we have to make it feasible to build up. I mean, for example, in New York City, there's a lot of regulation about reworking neighborhoods. And, you look at, there were a lot of 2-story row houses that really could be replaced with 3- and 4-story apartment buildings that provide a lot more housing. And we have the subway system right there, right? Downtown Brooklyn, New York, they allowed high rises in parts of Brooklyn where the transportation network is there. Same true in the borough of Queens, part of New York. So I think even in cities like New York or London, well, I don't know enough about London, but I certainly know in New York, we can change the zoning and allow for more construction in areas where we have the transportation network. And by the way, it's the subway systems that many, or metro systems that many cities have built are still not fully utilized. So we have the capacity there. Let's use it. In the New York area, commuter rail lines are not as commuter usage is not back up to pre-COVID levels, for example, part of work from home. But hey, we have the train lines like the Long Island Railroad or the Metro North Railroad or New Jersey Transit. Rezone along the corridors. We can do it in a much smarter way. And I would challenge anybody who's opposed to putting up 3 or 4 story apartments, go to the uptown section of Dallas. Developers like Craig Hall, Ross Perot Jr. built beautiful neighborhoods. And I mean beautiful neighborhoods where you want to live. And so once again, it's not just deregulating per se. It's about sensibly regulating and doing it in a smart way. And these are this is part of Dallas that's going to be there for a long time. These are not shabbily built places. And it's transformed the city. And we have opportunities. One last thing I really think we haven't touched on is mixed use. Too much, we had this notion that we're going to have a city center where we're going to have all these office buildings. People commute into work, and then they live in maybe suburbs or residential areas. That deliberately creates sprawl and needs to commute. Right now, with work from home, we have in New York, we have vacant buildings. In London, you have some. Other cities. And by the way, you'll notice that the restaurants and the other shops that are related to office employment, they're struggling. You see vacant storefronts in San Francisco, New York, parts of Cleveland. So if we think about, hey, let's maybe rezone a little bit. Let's say, hey, we've got some what we call Class C buildings that are pretty old. If we just don't do anything, they're going to stay vacant, and that's not good for the city. Let's rezone it. If we have to tear them down, tear them down. If we have to convert, we convert. Let's build some housing in some urban environments where we already have the infrastructure. We just need to rezone it. Work from home gives us that opportunity. And if we're smart, we'll take it. If we're not, just think about what a city's going to feel like if you've got a lot of vacant buildings and storefronts. It's not going to feel safe. It's not going to feel vibrant. And it's going to stay that way for a long time until we bite the bullet and redevelop it. So in every disruption, there's an opportunity. And we got that right now. So
and to that point on mixed use, I think we have a little bit more of it in the UK, but this idea about mixed use also interests me as well, because it almost allows for a little bit more for localization of certain amenities and for work. If you do happen to have a home or a residential property in the middle of an area where there's a lot of economic activity, potentially you can walk to work, or your commute is very sort of short-winded and you have the amenities around you. And you do see that in London and in the towns across the UK. You do have, there are some housing specific areas for sure, but it's much more interspersed with housing, mixed housing with shops on the ground floor. You see this a lot in London and sort of like the sprawling areas around London. And my understanding with a lot of the sort of suburban areas of the States and maybe sort of the more rural areas is that zoning is very much along the lines of, right, this is an area for housing, this is an area for business and all this kind of stuff. And I think that almost factors into what we were talking about earlier. Whereas if you basically say, if you can only have housing here, you can only have businesses here, you can only have X where, you're now creating separate zones across the place in which people suddenly have to travel all the way over to be able to communicate. And that's not necessarily good for economic, prosperity, for moving around, but also for individual happiness and things as well. And so I think, to your point, maybe an incorporation, and this could be like part of the reforming regulation that you mentioned, to allow for more mixed use housing, but also mixed use spaces and zoning, would maybe sort of mitigate a lot of these problems, and would necessarily sort of, just help mitigate some of these housing pressures.
To think about what's happened in many urban centers. Uh, we fell into the trap of in parts of the U.S. where we had just these office buildings or apartment buildings with no street lights. And then they figured out, well, hey, maybe we should have the coffee shops, the restaurants on the ground floor, and all that, and then have the apartments above. And that model facilitates street life, and that makes the place safer. And you know all that can work together. So it's about deliberate planning. We have to nudge local areas to not my backyard kind of
Yeah,
their broader social needs, but we also have to be sensitive to, hey, maybe they need more transportation, maybe they need brownfield assistance with taking uh, a polluted area and cleaning it up so that they can redevelop it. And I think if we do that, we can also address the sprawl issue, not have as much negative effect on the environment. What's happened is we've got used to doing things a certain way because we thought it seemed to work. But what happens is situations, times change, and what used to work may not work, and we then have to go back and re-examine. And I think it's just a good time to re-examine.
sure. If you were advising a Western government, whether that be the US, America, the States, or the UK, or elsewhere, on regards to mitigating some of these issues that we've been talking around in terms of housing policy and economic development regarding housing, what are some recommendations that you would make to them that you think could help ameliorate and mitigate some of these things that we've talked about?
Well, first, have a stable and sensible regulation of mortgages and banking, so you don't get these you know, booms and busts because lenders ease their credit standards. We have done it with Basel III. You've got to be careful about backtracking. So Basel III is an arrangement across different countries that we try to have a sensible mortgage and banking regulations across the advanced economies. I think that's basically been done. Second, and this touches to a point that you've made, is we have to be wary about kicking off large swings in mortgage interest rates that can induce big house price swings. We have to take into account that housing is very sensitive to demand when housing supply is constrained, which is which is the situation we're in. Then we have to do a comprehensive approach to dealing with housing supply. We have to address zoning in a sensible way to increase the supply of buildable lots, allow for multifamily, along corridors where it makes sense. We also have to deal with the issues of building as well. There we have to think about, allowing builders to build in different ways. It doesn't mean that they have to use substandard materials. We don't want that, but we allow them to build prefab houses and factories, and then also deal with the transportation and IT infrastructure so that people can, feasibly commute when they need to commute or work in new areas. If we do this in a comprehensive way, we can solve it. If we do it in a haphazard way, what I fear is going to happen is, we allowed the zoning, we eased zoning, but nothing happened. Well, it's because we have bottlenecks with shortages of workers who aren't trained, or builders who have their hands tied about, doing more things productively. So if we do things in a more holistic way, recognizing that housing and construction is a complicated thing. It's not just simply somebody, banging a nail into a 2x4 or
Sure.
putting up some bricks. It involves a lot of things. We have to be more sensible and more proactive. I think if we do all that, we can address these issues. And I think, if we look back on what happened after World War II in the US, for example, we were very intentional about improving transportation infrastructure, increasing housing supply, and providing loans for, let's say, veterans or the general public to buy the houses. But we dealt with both supply and demand. It's like the old joke: every answer in economics is supply and demand. Uh,
No, certainly. And just to round out our conversation here, given the results of your research and the findings that you were able to come to, is there a piece of research that you would like to see conducted in the future that you think could help build upon the findings and provide some, real benefit to the economic literature?
Well, we've already seen much new research that's addressed mortgage and bank regulation, and we've improved our models of looking at housing at the local level. And that's very important. It's very great. More research needs to be done on housing supply. Uh, I mentioned the great work by Ed Glazer and Joe Giorco, for example, but also on how we can sensibly bolster housing supply. What works? Let's have some research on, does a housing development corporation, which let's say buys land, uh, you know, builds multifamily housing, or lets people buy those houses. When they sell back to the housing development corporation. It sells to another, let's say working or middle class family. You know, things, do they work? Does modular construction make a difference? What type of zoning matters? So better, having better supply side policy requires better research. What works, what doesn't? That can help stabilize policies, address our housing shortage and affordability crisis. But to do that research, we also need to provide researchers with better databases. A lot of data is expensive these days. I do a lot of work in commercial real estate, but boy, some of those databases are very expensive, and maybe government can subsidize or create some of those databases so that we can come up with better policy. I think that would help a lot. I don't know what works in different areas. One size does not fit all. But if we have a sense of what works and where and under certain circumstances, we can make much better decisions. And I think that was part of the reason why we have social science. It's part of the reason, for example, they created the Department of Commerce in the US. They created that to partly create data so that business people know what's going on in the economy. They can make better decisions. That's why we had the GDP statistics, which were created after World War II. Richard Stone, the Nobel laureate, created them for the UK, Son Cousins for the US. That was very important because before then, we didn't have the big picture. We didn't know what was going on. People want to make decisions in a world where they understand what's going on. So if we reduce uncertainty by having better data, more relevant research, we can make more informed decisions. And I hope that that's where we go. I think there is some great work being done. More work needs to be done. These are important issues. They literally hit home. No pun intended. But they literally hit home. I mean, for many people, their house is their biggest asset.
Yep,
And
certainly.
where we work and live, we have a sense of place. I might be an economist, and people might think, "Oh, you're some nerd just cranking out all these formulas and econometric estimates and the like." But I've lived in many houses, and I love living in a house, and I love the places where I live, and it's part of being human, right? I mean, and this is why housing is such a sensitive thing. But we can't just react with emotions or fall for short-term solutions like price controls or rent controls. We have to think beyond that and what will work.
Absolutely. I agree. John, thank you very much for joining me. I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your listeners, and I can't thank you enough.